Hi, and good morning, everyone. Special thanks to those watching us live on YouTube. Here with me is Aroma Rodrigues from Massachusetts, and she will present a talk on the how much the news media are polarized. But before I let you in, I just wanted to say that please ask your questions in the live chat on YouTube. All these questions will be asked answered in the end during the Q&A session. And please do not wait till the end of the talk with your question because the live stream is a little bit delayed. All right, Aroma, you are welcome, and I'm leaving.
Thanks so much. So welcome everyone from wherever you are. I'm in a place where it's like 4 o'clock in the morning, but I'm happy to be presenting this topic to you. So we are going to talk today about whether the news media is actually polarized or whether we are being conditioned to think it is. So a little bit about myself. I'm a student. I'm a grad student at UMass Amherst. Socio-technological analysis is a hobby. So what I like to do is go through a lot of societal issues or um, things of interest and like sort of interact them with technology, machine learning, or natural language processing. And that's like a hobby of sorts. I've spoken at various PyCons, PyCon ZA, PyOhio, etc. Um, and this talk is basically about what a failed experiment taught me about news bias and polarization. So a quick survey for all of you. I know this is not very interactive, but I hope you'll respond to me. So, how many of us in the room think that the news media is heavily polarized in the world today? Every time I've asked this question to a group of my friends, most of them have said, I feel that the news media is very polarized. So, like, what do Americans say? Uh, as compared to a survey done in 1984, in 2017, the number of people who said that the media is not careful to separate fact from opinion has increased. So it has increased from around 42% before to around 66% now. And that is actually very concerning because if you cannot trust the news media and if you think the news media is biased, then what is fact and what is opinion? Similarly, in the UK, there was a survey conducted by this organization called YouGov. What they did was they went to people and they told them the name of a news media publication, the ones that you see on your left. So some of these publications are the Guardian, the Mirror, the Independent, etc. And they asked a bunch of people, "What do you think? Where do the biases of these particular UK newspapers sort of lie?" And these are the results. So as you can see, the results are not fairly conclusive because you see people's perception of where the mainstream UK newspapers bias sort of lies varies so much from person to person, right? It wouldn't actually make sense for people to think that one newspaper is slightly left of center and slightly right of center too. That probably means they are neutral. Similarly, there was a survey conducted by All Slides, and they've created like this media bias chart. This includes publications from the UK as well as the US. So what do we do with this? I decided to conduct an experiment. I wanted to see if um, the headlines or the articles that came out of these publications had a direct correlation with people's perception of their biases. Um, so, why should we study this phenomenon? Why did I decide to go do this experiment? Um, so, we'll talk a little bit about natural language processing and whether it will be as common as statistics one day. We all know statistics, we all have used statistics. It was popularized in the 15th century and it's now a commonly used tool. to describe phenomena in a variety of scientific domains, including biology, astronomy, etc. We can use statistics because mathematics is the language of science, it's the underlying language of science. But what about society? What is the language of laws, judiciary, social science, humanity in general? That's the language that we speak in, right? So, can natural language processing be able to quantify social phenomena of sorts? Considering that natural language processing literally converts spoken language or written language into a form that can be computed upon. I believe this is true, and that one day natural language processing will be as common as statistics and will be used to define the various social phenomena occurring in the world. The second thing is quantifying the biases in language. In the recent past, it has sort of become obvious to us that the usage of human language has a lot of biases. For example, the usage of master slaves in electronics and computer science, or the usage of the word blacklist. While we can think of these phenomena as the cultural markers of a politically incorrect time, they're triggering for people who have been at the receiving end of such cultural barbs. Such a language, when used like in a professional environment or in an environment where the government is sort of involved, it could be a really bad experience for people who've been at the receiving end of these cultural barbs historically. So we should try to quantify the biases in our language that we use today and try to reduce them as much as possible. The last point that I would like to make is social responsibility. As social media sites across the world grapple with hate speech, calls for genocides, and sexual harassment on their platforms, as policy scientists look up the various biases in our justice system's usage of language, and as most of the people in the world struggle with what is globally called the media bias, I believe that as mathematics and statistics become commonplace measures, so will machine learning models. Basically, machine learning models will be used to quantify all of these biases that we sort of talk about. This work is an example of an intersection of a non scientific field with computer science and mathematics, trying to quantify, measure, and identify non mathematical phenomena in the language of mathematics. It is important because it could be the basis of scientific approaches that the next generation policymakers, voters, nonprofit social organizations, and governments could use to make life changing decisions for their citizens. So basically, in the future, it's very possible that laws are measured using natural language processing, and then there's like a computation and there's an algorithm. Um, Based in machine learning or an AI model, and it sort of tells you whether those laws are compatible with the sort of society that we want. Um, so, how polarized is the news media really? And how does one go around quantifying it? So, for an experiment to go right, we first describe what the scope of that experiment is. So, the definition of the news media for the scope of this experiment was this: I used only established news organizations. I do not include shows like The Daily Show, which is a source of news for many people, or opinion shows like The View or Fox and Friends. I used online content on their website, articles. They included a little bit of opinion pieces, but not a lot. And I did not include any social media content at all. The reason I did this is because all of these shows, the social media content, they do not come under the purview of news. Though it is consumed as news by a variety of people, it is technically not news. So often this content is very clickbaity and it may have like very misleading headlines and such. So we should try to stay away from it maybe. Um, so this is the definition of the experiment that I sort of conducted. My experiment was to study the varying levels of polarization induced in a neural network by feeding it newspaper articles with manufactured sentiments according to the All Slides media bias chart for the level of faith people on various aisles of the political spectrum have. This basically means that, say, I'm a person on one side of the political spectrum. I have certain sentiments about certain publications, right? Because of the political aisle that I'm a part of. So, can a neural network sort of incorporate this sentiment? If I feed it sentiments generated according to like one person's bias. So our X was the article or the headline of the article, and a Y was the credence or the belief of that particular person who was looking at that particular news article or news headline. Some state of the art and related work is displayed on the screen here. So these are some of the papers that I went through before conducting this experiment. One of them is a paper called Online News Media Bias Analysis using an LDA NLP approach. So this is a very primitive approach. Long before neural networks was widely used in natural language processing, we used to use this technique called a backwards. So that this particular paper was using that primitive technique. So I decided not to use it. The second one was a political ideology detection using a recursive neural network, except uh, the things that were fed to this particular network were not news articles or headlines. They were speeches given by like political entities. Another one was the identification and analysis of media bias in news articles. It was by Newsbird. It's an aggregator. So this paper actually was the presentation of a data set of sorts. I've used this data set for my experiment. Another one was quantifying perceived political bias of newspapers through a document classification technique. This paper introduced a document encoding technique, and that was something that I used in some of my experiments as well. The other one is media bias, the social sciences, and NLP, automating frame analysis to identify bias by word choice and labeling. This one looked only at word choice biases. For example, a certain group of people indulging in violence could be considered as terrorists by one news organization and as freedom fighters by the other. So they were looking at a very deeper problem, while I was looking at a very broader problem. Another one was detecting media bias in news articles using Gaussian bias distribution. So this one used very specific annotated data, which was something that I did not have on hand, which is why I did not use this technique. But this is some of the related work and the state of art as it exists for something related to what I did. So I used 5 data sets for my experiments. The data sets that I used are the COVID alien data set. So basically, over the pandemic, Alien compiled a data set of news articles and headlines from the UK and US media about a pandemic. Um, then there was a topic based 200K news headlines from the year 2012 to 2018 by Kaggle. I found this to be particularly interesting because I believe if you ask most people, they would say that the peak of media polarization happened in 2016. So we had the year 2016 in the years 2012 to 2018. There was another data set called NELA, um, which compiled all the headlines and the articles in the year 2017. Another one was All the News Gaggle. Another one that I used was EMNLP Basel dataset. So this dataset is one of the datasets that was presented in the papers that I showed you before. A fake news dataset was also compiled using news headlines from The Spoof, which is an online journal that publishes fake news as satire jokes. I'll tell you what I use that for. Um, so we'll look at the specifications, or let's look at the design of the experiment. Some of the questions that I had to answer when I was designing this experiment was whether I should be using a document encoding or a sentence encoding. Um, some data sets had its own limitations. Encoding techniques have their own limitations. And the experiment failed to show any patterns when it came to using certain encoding techniques for certain data sets. So I had to experiment on a few things before coming up with the sort of encoding that I want to go with, or the data sets that I want to go with. And the last question is a headline a good representation of bias? Like, do I think that this sentiment analysis can be done on the basis of only the headline and not the content of the entire article? And I'll tell you why that's a good thing to do. Question time. So, do these sentences show you any level of biases according to you? These are the sentences. Um, so, ironically, these are the headlines for the exact same article. There have been like literally no changes in the article. The publisher of these articles is the same, except that they happened in two different editions. So the first one says Bernie Sanders scored victories for years via legislative side doors. And the second one says, while legislative side doors, Bernie Sanders won modest victories. So the first one is very positive, and the second one tries to downplay the victories a little bit. So as you can see, this is where the last question sort of gets answered. Is a headline a good representation of bias? I found that a headline is actually a very good representation of bias because in a lot of cases, the headline was sometimes like clickbaity of sorts. Um, Sometimes the headline had nothing to do with the article that was written, or it deviated a little bit from the multiple publications. What are the other problems that I had to address with respect to the design of this particular experiment? So, is the sentiment evoked from a headline enough to indicate some bias? So what do we say is a sentiment evoked from a headline? Say you have a sentence. There is a certain sentiment that the sentence sort of gives out, and it's one of the standard tasks in natural language processing to extract a sentiment from a given sentence. Some of the most popular tasks that have been completed using natural language processing are Twitter sentiment or Yelp review sentiment, which is where you write a paragraph as a review and there's like a star system. So the natural language processor has some idea of what you're trying to say in terms of like the star system, which is like a numerical score of sorts, and your text, which is encoded into like a vector form. So your processor sort of learns the features it needs to evoke like a particular sentiment from that particular review. So can a headline be considered a review of the state of affairs? Yes, it can. As we saw in the last example, a headline is actually a very good is a very good sentence or like uh, input to be used to calculate the sentiment. Can a neural network be polarized if it were to learn from the perspective of a biased news consumer? Now, this is the question that we're going to address in the experiment. Does the category of news a biased consumer trust completely affect the perception when it comes to fake news? So, what this basically means is like, say I'm on the left aisle of the political spectrum, does that make me more vulnerable to fake news? Or say I'm on the right end of the political spectrum, does that make me more vulnerable to fake news? So the methodology that I used was basic sentiment classification and binary classification in the detection of fake news. My pipeline for the sentiment analysis looked like this. So at the top, we have all of our data sets. So all of these experiments were conducted independently, which meant that each of the data set went through the pipeline. Um, for example, if we take data set one, the data set one was encoded using the Twitter Roberta model and then using a Yelp bird model. So these are like two different experiments. In experiment one, it was encoded using Twitter Roberta. Experiment two, it was encoded using Yelp bird because I wanted to see which sentiment encoder did well, and then it was fed into a variety of architectures. Some of the architectures you can see here, I use CNNs, LSTMs, GRUs, wireless TMs, etc., um, to try to find out if the neural network could learn some sort of sentiment from the headlines. For the fake news detection, I had a similar setup, except there was a new data set here, which was a fake news data set. As usual, all of the data sets were converted into encodings or embeddings using the Twitter Roberta model or the Yelp BERT model, and then fed to a binary classifier. So over here, the classifier is a categorical classifier. So um, we saw in some of the slides before that our political aisles were from 1 to 5, which is like very left, center, slightly right, and very right, right? So this particular architecture, the last layer, would basically categorize either of the sentiments into one of the categories, like from 1 to 5. And over here, it would just categorize it as fake news or not. So this is a binary classifier. Some of the results you can see over here, most of the data sets did not do well in terms of learning the biases, which led me to believe that news media is not as biased as we think it is. Some of the biases, some of the data sets that did well with biases, one of them was the EMNLP one. The reason why the EMNLP did really well was because it had been hand annotated for the bias as whether it was left, right, or center. It had been hand annotated because, as I told you, EMNLP was a data set that had already been presented as a paper. So there had been a lot of people who had put in work into it and had been hand annotated. This basically means these are some of the conclusions from the experiment. This basically means that while some level of polarization exists, there is no polarization on the basis of the perceived bias as calculated by all slides in their surveys or the other organization, which was YouGov for UK. Some news articles do take ideologically polarizing stance in the articles, but this is not true with respect to most of the articles, which is why our neural network was not able to learn bias as well. If you remember, the number of opinion articles in this data set was very less. So say I redo this experiment with only opinion pieces, maybe it'll learn a high level of bias. Secondly, hand annotated articles are the best data set to conduct news media bias studies, as the neural networks seem to learn best from features learned by these annotated data sets. The US COVID dataset was more polarized than the UK COVID dataset. For both NELA 2017 dataset and the All the News dataset, a filtered version of the dataset that included the keyword Trump polarized the neural network more than the non filtered version. This points to the possibility that topical bias may exist in these publications, but it's not very widespread. For the fake news vulnerability analysis, now that was bad news. For the fake news vulnerability analysis, there were some interesting trends too. All the categories for the data sets are pretty much robust and not vulnerable to fake news to a great degree, which basically means that if you have a model that tries to predict whether a headline is part of like a fake news or whether it's actual news, the model does really well with almost all the news data sets. The CNN and the BiGRE models gave 100% accuracy for all the cases. BiLSTM showed some variations. Here for the UK COVID news dataset, when we used Yelp embeddings, the vulnerability decreased for centrist news agencies. An opposite trend was observed for the US COVID news. The centrist news agency reporting had a lower accuracy when detecting fake news. This could be because of the way Yelp and Twitter Roberta models learned features, or it could be because of the fake news that was sourced from the website The Spoof, which is very US centric. Um, this is an interesting trend where the NELA 2017 dataset, when filtered on the keyword Trump, developed some level of vulnerability towards fake news, especially the extreme left leaning news publications. So, my concluding observations from this experiment are the SVMs perform better clustering with respect to the categories than most neural networks have. However, the maximum does not cross 67%, which means the bias is not widespread. The most significant conclusion from this work is that though there is a perceived bias when it comes to news agencies, when looked at from a neural network standpoint, it is negligible when you consider all the articles. Mainstream news agencies are not able to polarize a neural network with inherent biases in their headlines. There may be topical biases that need to be examined by using like an entity linking and a bias calculation approach, like maybe filtering a data set on the basis of a keyword, finding out if it links to one particular entity, which is a part of the Wikipedia universe of sorts, and then doing a bias calculation approach to see if that particular entity is causing bias in news media. Um, but that was not in the scope of this particular experiment. Most mainstream news agencies do not make the consumer vulnerable to believing fake news. This is actually good news. The study needs to be conducted with data from popular social media news groups or popular TV shows that masquerade as news, but may technically not even be news channels. It's safe to conclude that perceived bias that stems from social media polarization is being extended to news media when the contribution to the polarization may be minimal. Um, we'll go over the significance of this work. The significance of this work is to be able to transform a social problem into a technical one and using neural networks and machine learning techniques to try to gain some insights. Hopefully, using these techniques to find deeper trends will become mainstream and help policymakers and general citizens approach news media bias in a better light. Some future work on these would be to do like an experiment on the effect of news media on perceptron networks, using better annotated data sets to perform bias analysis, to study the effect of memory models and media bias, to experiment on some of the most polarizing news epochs in time, and studies on country level news biases. Thank you so much for listening to me. We will now start the Q&A session.
Thank you, Aroma, for an excellent talk. And actually, there's a proof to this. So we have a couple of nice comments. And while the users are asking questions, I have a question myself. So you addressed the US and UK media, right? Could you somehow extrapolate to the media in other countries, other languages perhaps?
Uh,
Is it biased as well or no?
Not really. So, first of all, the data sets that were available were very US or UK centric. Very few Australian news media organizations were even included in those data sets. So for us to conduct any sort of experiments, either we have to like develop our own data sets that has a good mixture of news media from all over the world. And secondly, while I would say that the UK and the US have good checks on independent media, that's not true for the rest of the world. So when we are looking at analysis of news media, especially in countries where media is sort of state sponsored, this experiment could potentially show biases when compared to like um, equivalent news in the international sections of the UK or the US media. But it would definitely be an interesting experiment to go ahead and include all of the other countries, some other languages into this experiment.
It would actually be probably a good proof of feasibility of your approach to apply this to, well, let's not label the countries, but there are known very non-democratic countries, right? You can just apply your techniques there and find the bias, and that might be a good proof of your approach, right?
Yeah, that's actually a very good
Yeah.
suggestion. Except the news coming out from these agencies, very few news is actually in English. So
Yes, absolutely.
yes,
But I guess you can compute embeddings in other languages too.
yes, yes.
Yes, there must be. Okay, there's one more question from David. You mentioned that it is generally thought that in 2016 polarization peaked. Was there any particular reasons this was the case in the UK and US and perhaps elsewhere? So, what was the reason for the 2016 peak in um, polarization?
The 2016 peak stems from the US elections. 2016 was when there were US elections, and in general, there is polarization during election years. But 2016 was a little different because one of the candidates was a very famous media personality. So they already knew a lot about how media sort of works. So it was even more polarized.
Okay, great. Thanks. I don't see any more questions from the audience. With that, let me thank you once more to giving us this excellent talk and hope to see you at other PyCons sometime in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Thank
Well,
you so
yeah,
much.
bye bye.